What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. With me is my guest and personal friend, Steve Horn. How you doing, Steve?
Hey, I'm doing pretty well. It's getting pretty warm in Southern California, as you probably know, but doing okay. How are you?
I'm good. So I've known Steve for a few years. He's been a staff writer for DeSmog Blog, and now he is the climate reporter for the Real News Network. You just wrote an article for DeSmog Blog about the right-wing groups that are behind the Open the Economy protests. And you have said that they're the same groups funding the climate science denial movement. So I'm going to read a paragraph from your article, and then we'll get right into it. Weeks into that public health crisis, and with more than 750,000 cases and over 41,000 deaths in the U.S., groups nationwide are clamoring for an early end to stay-at-home orders and a reopening of state economies. Many of those same groups, a DeSmog investigation shows, are also part of what sociologist Robert Bruhl has called the climate change counter movement, and what U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has coined web of denial. So tell us about the parallels to climate science denialism.
What's striking is the techniques that have been used over the past several weeks and how it's changed. And so it's sort of the cycle of denial. It goes from you just deny that it's a problem at all. So if you look at Trump and people like of his ideology, it was, this isn't really a big deal. It's kind of like the flu. It's it won't be like it was anywhere else in the world. And it goes from there all the way to like through a cycle of increasingly like some acceptance, but not all the way, still casting some doubt, to the point where it is now is that, well, it is bad, but there's really nothing we can actually do about it. Therefore, we should just go back to business as usual because the cost of it would be too high. It would be too costly to the economy. It's going to cost too many jobs. And if that sounds familiar, like for people who follow climate change and for people who follow energy politics and stuff, that's because it's, as the article lays out, a lot of the groups that are bolstering this argument that's being made in the streets in different states around the country are the same groups who have made these kind of arguments. And what I will say, though, is a lot of these groups actually haven't gone that far through the cycle. A lot of them are just straight up still denial groups. But that said, yeah, I think that the pattern of denial, the different phases of denial are definitely in play with COVID-19, at least on the conservative right, both at the grassroots and at the highest levels of power.
Okay, so let's start with Michigan. Talk about who is behind that and what they have been able to effectuate.
Yeah, well, Michigan was the one that I think opened everyone's eyes to this phenomenon. So I don't want to take any credit for discovering the initial stuff about Michigan. So basically, there were reports after the Michigan blow up last week in which they went to the state house and, among other things, chanted, "Lock her up," for the governor in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, Democratic governor, about her stay-at-home order. But basically, what was reported back then and what I expanded upon is that the group that was actually telling people to go out to the streets and do this, one of them is funded. It's by the name of Michigan Freedom Fund. Is like 98% funded or something like that, above 95% at least, by the DeVos Family Foundation, which of course is of Betsy DeVos family fortune, the United States Secretary of State, currently infamous before that, and even now for her pushing of charter schools across the country using that foundation money to do it. And of course, infamous perhaps even more for their family, which owns the family fortune, which owns the Amway Corporation. But yeah, so that is the money behind the Michigan stuff. And that is like really the only one that I've, as my story will talk about, that is the only one where I can directly say that those groups were literally getting their support base behind going to the rally. Everyone else was more like amplifying what was being done and kind of saying this is the righteous cause and what they should be doing. But what's also important about the Michigan Freedom Fund, and as I'll talk about some of these other groups, they're all, and the ties back to DeVos as well, the funding, is they're all affiliate members of something called the State Policy Network, which is a right-wing apparatus that exists in pretty much every state in this country. They are, I guess in name, think tanks, but basically propaganda groups that promote right-wing causes like anti-union, anti-environment, anti-healthcare, whatever the progressive causes. These groups have the opposite stance of that and have had it for decades. And basically, I think the most important thing to understand about the State Policy Network is it's not just, they don't exist in isolation as kind of putting ideas out there. They were actually a creation, and I reported this for DeSmog several years ago, many years ago, actually 2013. They are a creation of the American Legislative Exchange Council. So Alec, which is the group known for promoting model bills and passing model bills in state houses across the country that are written by corporate lobbyists, who has been around, they've been around since the 1970s. But Alec, like after 15 years in existence, thought, well, you know, it would be a great idea to make these right-wing insane ideas a lot more popular among, in state houses and get people to support them and get legislators to support them. Well, if we have think tanks backing them. And so I found an old report, this is my earlier reporting on this, a report that existed in some kind of like philanthropy magazine that was buried on the tobacco archives. But basically that report spells out like what SPN, or the State Policy Network, is and was and why it existed. And literally in that I was looking back at it this week, that report says outright, one of the people in the conservative movement, they're saying the State Policy Network is not really about the ideas themselves as a think tank. It's just more like they're there for essentially like the propaganda. I don't think they used that word, but they were explicitly saying it's not, these aren't like high-minded ivory tower type factories. These exist to promote the agenda of institutions like Alec.
Right. Well, Alec is one of them that we've known about for a long time. And it's really interesting because doing my show with Winona Hodder earlier today and with Bill McKibben, I'm going to do tomorrow, looking back on, 50 years since the first Earth Day and the environmental movement, it's clear that Nixon was no liberal, but what he was doing was responding to the movements of the day. And there was clearly an anti-war movement. There was clearly an anti-pollution movement. We didn't really know about global warming then. Well, I guess they did. If you looked at Michael Moore's movie yesterday, there was some clip from the 50s where the scientists knew about it. And of course, that's the climate science denialism that you're talking about. And there's also the same people are probably the public relations firms. I read a great article who were behind the denying that tobacco is bad for your health, that smoking causes cancer. They have the same PR firms that just went from one cause to the other. But back then, they didn't have what they have now. And the greatest movie, and I always like to plug it because a friend of mine made it, Donald Goldmacher, it's called Heist, Who Stole American Democracy? And he organizes that movie based on the Powell Memo. And the Powell Memo talked about, it was something Lewis Powell wrote for the Chamber of Commerce before he was a justice on the Supreme Court. And he talked about, we need to get a hold of the law, we need to start lobby firms, because it was before K Street was very big. We need to start think tanks. We need to get into the universities. We need to have a news media network, news media outlet like Fox News. And all of this happened just like as if it had been orchestrated. I mean, I don't really think there was anybody there, pulling the strings, but independently, all those things happened, and the right wing has become such a big force that the left wing has been completely impotent. And not only because of lack of strategy, but by intention, with Bill Clinton, intentionally going to Wall Street because that's where the money is, and adopting this triangulation neoliberal approach.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
before we get to the next state, which I wanted to ask you about, which is Idaho, do you have any comments on what I just said?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that I was probably going to say that at the end of discussing this, but that's a really important context, especially in the Earth Day, Earth Week situation that we're in. And I was thinking about the Powell Memo yesterday when I was just kind of like, because I was thinking in my head, like, what are we going to talk about on the show today? And I was thinking about the Powell Memo, and like, because I was thinking about what happened in the 1970s in the aftermath of Earth Day. And the Powell Memo is 1971. So it's literally 1 year after. I looked back at the Powell Memo today, and in the Powell Memo, he specifically does mention like anti-consumer groups and people who care about the environment. And it's important that it's known as the Powell Memo today, but the actual title of the memo was something like Response to the Attack on American Free Enterprise. So it was Lewis Powell saying that he did see what existed on Earth Day as essentially, more or less a threat to free market capitalism. And I think that also goes back to like the original Earth Day. The demands were so much more radical than the way that we see Earth Day today and experience Earth Day, where it's been so greenwashed by corporations, we'll say, and co-opted by corporations, and something that we're all a part of. It's been hyper sanitized. And that's an important thing, is just to look back at what were people saying at the first Earth Day? What were their demands? Like you said, it wasn't climate change, but it was still sort of, they were critiquing the things that were the conditions that basically has created climate change today. So I think that it's important. It's really important to understand like how the right wing reacted to this Earth Day and other movements that were going on at the time. And yeah, they've really created a tour de force, really, from the 1970s onward. In 1973, I'll just say, since we're talking about Alec right now, I think that was the year of the formation of Alec, for example. So that's only a few years after Earth Day, and of course all the other social movements that existed in the 1960s. So yeah, I feel like just looking back at what happened in the 1970s, it's such an important decade to understand dynamics today.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know that really the start of neoliberalism began under Jimmy Carter. And I'm going to post an article from Salon into the comments, because I really learned a lot about him. I guess I wasn't paying that much attention during his presidency. We remember him now more fondly as this great post-president. Getting back to your article, talk about what you uncovered in Idaho.
So Idaho goes back to the State Policy Network, but they have a group called the Idaho Freedom Foundation, which did not quite directly like tell their people to go out and protest and organize the protest in the same way as the Michigan Freedom Fund. But what they did sort of instead is they still like used some of their assets just to say that in general they support the cause of what was being called Disobey Idaho, which was the protest there. And so their executive director, as I found out on his Facebook page, his name is Wayne Hoffman. He used to be a spokesperson for U.S. Representative Bill Sally, who was a Republican in Idaho, who also was a climate change denier, which was another parallel that I always look to see, like, what are their connections, and did those institutions engage in climate change denial, because that was the theme of the article. But yeah, he basically I'll just read the quote because it's sort of instructive to see like what this orbit is saying. It's not just crazy people in the streets and lunatics, but it's actually like well-respected vestiges of the conservative apparatus are saying these kind of things. So here's what Executive Director Wayne Hoffman of the Idaho Freedom Foundation said. He said, "We should not permit the government to cage us like animals, allowed for us feedings and occasional fresh air. Free people don't live like this. If you value your freedom, if you want your kids and grandkids and their kids and grandkids to experience what it means to have unalienable rights, the time to act is now." And he wrote that the day before their, what they were calling Disobey Idaho last week. So this is, I mean, yeah, this is not just the fringes of the right wing out in the streets, like what we're considering like the alt-right maybe today, or the Trumpian right. This is like the mainstream conservative movement in a state like Idaho.
Wow. So when you do your research, do you actually try to talk to some of these people that are following these groups to see what it is they are influenced by, or, why they agree with this stuff? I don't get it, I mean, are they ignorant? Are they brainwashed? What's the deal with them?
I will confess that in this article, I didn't take the time to contact the sources. I wish I would have before public. Now I probably can't. I wish I would have, because it would have been interesting to hear, like, I mean, maybe learn a little bit more about funding. They probably wouldn't say who's funding them, but at the very least, it would have been, interesting to hear, like, what their concerns are scientifically, or if they like actually believe that this is a public health risk, and all of that. They don't express that in these writings, but I guess I'd be curious to hear what they said if pressed on it. I think like a lot of them are paying some, sort of going back to the playbook, they do like admit there's some public health concern, but it's always like the other part is the bigger risk, and that is the economic risk. So I think like the line that they've been using is like, is the cure worse than the disease? That's a new popular thing to say in these conservative circles.
Well, I was actually referring to the people that attend the protests.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean.
And let me ask you something. I posted when I saw what was going on in Michigan, I posted, thank God I live in California. And then almost immediately people were sharing with me the demonstration that went on in San Clemente. Now, San Clemente is not far from where you live at all. I was wondering if you had gone over to check that out, if you would go over there with your N95 mask. I've been out. I've covered 3 protests with my N95 mask.
In San Diego County, there was a big one on Sunday, fairly big, in Encinitas, which is in northern San Diego County on the coast. And there's been, I think the San Diego County Sheriff pressed some charges against those people who were out demonstrating. So I'm not sure if anyone else anywhere else has been pressed with actual charges yet, but yeah, there were, at least I saw there was one individual at that protest, if not multiple, who actually got charged with doing it, because it defies the county's order that exists right now not to be doing those kind of things. So basically, like,
you didn't go, right?
I didn't go to that. The thing I was going to ask is like, I'm a little bit too worried to do that kind of thing just for like public health reasons. But yeah.
Well,
Even with a mask.
I tell you, I'm cooped up in this house, and I do have an N95 mask I was planning to cover the Malibu fire, so it's a good one. And, I go there, I've got my selfie stick so I can hold my phone. I can keep pretty much of a safe distance from the subject I'm interviewing. Everybody I talk to is wearing masks. So I'm just not that worried about it. So 2 people got arrested at this not arrested. They got put in handcuffs. They were gonna arrest him, but then they realized the optics of that didn't look so good. So they took him out of the handcuffs and just gave him a citation. And I was posting about, oh, great. So people are getting, poor people who can't afford to pay their rent are getting cited for using a bullhorn and stopping. That's because they're supposed to keep moving when they protest. So they got cited for using a bullhorn and stopping when these people that are risking public health in Encinitas are not getting cited. Because the original article I read about Encinitas said that there were no citations, but the sheriff was thinking of possibly filing them afterwards. Mm-hmm. So did you read that he did?
At least one. Yeah, in the aftermath, at least one.
So talk about the last state that you covered, which was North Carolina. Who's behind them? What were they all about?
Yeah, so North Carolina was the least sort of direct, we'll say, like day before kind of thing, or their group. But in North Carolina, there was an individual who is a major funder of their group called the Civitas Institute, and his name is Bob Luddy, and he's well known as a right-wing donor in North Carolina. So he had written several articles sort of in solidarity with doing these kind of things, like basically just like saying it's like our duty to go out and protest this because this is terrible for the economy and will lead to worse things. And he's sort of one of the people who used that framework of the cure being worse than disease. And at first he was actually, before that though, he's almost embodies the framework itself. At the very first, he was downplaying how bad it was in previous articles, which I kind of outlined in the article. But yeah, so he wrote several of those in the American Spectator, which is, you know, a well-known conservative website, news website. And then those were published on the Civitas Institute website, and Civitas is also part of the State Policy Network. So that's the tie that binds all of these. Just to repeat, like that's I said it was funded by DeVos when I mentioned Michigan, but State Policy Network has historically also been funded by, like, you know, Koch Industries or many, you know, several the sort of like the well-known right-wing funders of the movement within the foundation world, plus corporations like ExxonMobil and others. So they don't necessarily fund SPN anymore, but that shows like whose agenda the State Policy Network has historically pushed, and State Policy Network then disseminates that funding to its states throughout the country. So this was this protest was called Reopen NC. And I think the common thing between all of these protests is that they're not like one-offs. It's like that more could happen in the future. And I will admit I haven't really followed like if there's been protests this week since the article went out. But I think that really one of the most interesting things I found in doing this article, and it had been reported before, but just to say it again, is that one of the people who backed all of this, like from a national level, is one of Trump's closest aides. So Stephen Moore is also affiliated with Alec. He's on their private sector board of advisors, and he used to be known as like an Alec scholar, one of those people they would trot out there as one of their like smart people when they went on TV. But yeah, he is the guy who said he hadn't really been tied back to Alec in this kind of network that I'm talking about, but what had been reported is that he compared the people who are out protesting in the streets to reopen the economy right now during this global pandemic. He compared them to, and caught a lot of flack for it, he compared them to Rosa Parks type people. So that was one thing that was pretty entertaining, and he got skewered for. But I think on the other hand, what I found really interesting about him, it shows that there's definitely money that's willing to back this. So he said that he knows of a major funder in the state of Wisconsin, which is where I grew up and originally from. But he said that there's a major backer in Wisconsin who's willing to pay for people's bail fees and legal fees if they go out and commit civil disobedience over this whole new right-wing movement that's formed. So I think that goes to show that this network has, I don't know if like for sure there's been money filtered to those groups that already existed, but maybe it opened funders' eyes to say, oh, hey, we support this and this is good. But for sure there's money going forward, because straight from Stephen Moore's mouth, he was on a show of another State Policy Network group, one of the kind of show that we're doing, like a Zoom type thing. And he was just talking about it, and it was the Colorado affiliate of the State Policy Network. So yeah, it's just interesting to see how all of this stuff is intertwined and how these different pieces fit together. And I would argue, like, I think it exhibits that we always say, I think there's been a lot of, like, remember in 2016, there was like the never Trump people within the Republican Party, but literally their apparatus like created the conditions that gave rise to someone like Trump. And it's almost like that's the Frankenstein that they created that now we're all dealing with.
Yeah, there's only one silver lining to these protests, is that maybe natural selection will apply and they'll all kill themselves off, while the rest of us who are smart and not science deniers are staying home, except me. I don't know that I would cover that protest, to be honest with you, because they all probably have it by now. Anyway, you mentioned Trump. Talk about, because you talked about this in your article a little bit, talk about how these groups are lobbying Trump, first of all. And then let me know your speculation as to whether he's in any way orchestrating this, or if he has knowledge about it, or is he just tweeting in support?
Well, I mean, definitely Stephen Moore, who's a really close aide to Trump, who was an economic advisor to his 2016 campaign and who was also nominated to serve on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve by Trump, but didn't make it through because most likely he's not qualified, even though he calls himself like an economist and stuff. A lot of people have questioned his actual credentials as an economist. He did not become a member of the board of governors of the Federal Reserve, but he definitely has Trump's ear. And the other really interesting tie to Trump here, and then I'll go to answer your question about like is Trump, what's he doing? What's his role in this, like overall? But one interesting thing going back to Michigan that ties back to Trump and Trump's team. What happened with Michigan is that particular protest was live streamed. I don't know if all of them are, but the Michigan one, which was the first really like the a big one, I think that one had the most people. That was actually live streamed by Breitbart. And so when I wrote the article, which was days after it had 5.8 million views on Facebook, which is just incredible. Just by comparison, the Michael Jordan, the Chicago Bulls documentary that ESPN just put out on Sunday, that got 6.1 million. That was ESPN's highest ever rated documentary kind of thing that they've ever put on TV, and they've been doing these for a long time. Their documentary series. So yeah, that shows the power of something like a Breitbart and the following that it has and the traction it can gain on social media. And so yeah, they disseminated that protest, and that goes back to who is Breitbart, and actually like how does this tie into all of it? Is that, well, actually the Mercers, or Robert Mercer was a major funder of Trump's 2016 campaign. Mercer how do I put it? He is a major funder also, or has been, of the State Policy Network and of member groups or affiliate groups like the Heartland Institute as one example. So has become very intertwined with the climate denial machinery. And of course, what is Breitbart most famous for? It's not really Mercer, who's behind in the shadows and the money man, but they're the most famous for Steve Bannon, who was running the website for years before he joined the Trump team in 2016 and eventually worked in the White House for a while. So that all goes to say that at the very least, so we're going to the point that now someone like Mercer is a major funder now. Again, in 2020, he announced that he's going to give a lot of money to Trump's campaign. So at the very least, Trump understands the politics of this and is reading the political tea leaves. And it's no accident that he did those tweets where he said, liberate Michigan, liberate this state, liberate that state. I mean, I don't think that was completely by accident. I think he probably is in communication with all of these people that we're talking about to some extent, and knows who his political base is, and is signaling to them that he supports them in that way through social media.
Now, his political base is also the evangelical movement. And we know that there have been many pastors who have been ignoring these stay-at-home orders and encouraging, people to congregate at their services. And this, I'm not just singling out the Christian evangelicals, because this also happened with the Orthodox Jewish community, but they quickly got themselves in line. I don't know about the Christians, but do you think that there's any connection with these funders and these evangelical groups, or are they just two separate crazy groups?
That is a great question, and I would love to see someone investigate that, like the politics of evangelicals, and if that ties into anything with state politics or federal politics right now through Pence and Trump. That's a good question. To me, in my head, they're separate but related, in that they are politically convenient pals that are not necessarily like have the same ideology, but have similar vessels through which they push their agenda. But yeah, that's a good question. I sort of doubt that at least the two sides are conspiring with one another, but probably at some level they both have Trump's ear, because look at what happened early on during this, when like most places were shutting down back in March. Who stayed open? It was Liberty University, which is Jerry Falwell Jr., who's really close with Trump, as well as a political person that he talks to tap into the evangelical base. So they kept their campus open while all other campuses were shutting down. And I think they eventually shut it down, but not until after some of their students were getting the virus and stuff. So they were very late to doing it. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there's communications with both sides through the Trump White House.
Well, you talk about ideology. They actually they legitimately deny science, whereas groups like the Heartland Institute, they just pretend to deny science. As Naomi Klein points out in her great book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, they understand more than anybody else about the climate crisis. And that's why they're working so hard, on behalf of their own interests.
Absolutely.